I get to do the introduction of our keynoter this morning, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to do that. I just met the fellow, young fellow, interesting fellow, who has done a lot of work in the trenches, and that's what my paper says, so I'll read it so I don't get lost. Seeking Justice is not a descriptive title for a conference. Rather, it is prescriptive, meaning that it aims not just to offer us information, but to incite us to act. That's what Larry Hamm has been all about for many years, leading actions, mostly grassroots actions, that seek greater justice, with the ultimate goal of achieving justice in practice. He, therefore, is just the right kind of keynoter for this conference. Larry's activism began early, and the targets of his activism have been diverse. In the late 1960s, as a high school student in Newark, New Jersey, he became the youngest school board member in the nation. Imagine. Some of us couldn't even count and such when we were in high school. Here's a school board member. In the 1970s, he led student demonstrations at Princeton against South African apartheid. Following his 1978 graduation cum laude from Princeton, Larry began his community activism in Newark, founding in 1983 a grassroots organization which his many other activities and affiliations have evolved from. The People's Organization for Progress, or POP. Got that? POP. Describes itself on the web as an independent, grassroots, community-based, politically progressive association of citizens working for racial, social, and economic justice and greater unity in the community. How's that for a mouthful? And a mission. The array of community issues that POP is actively involved in is daunting. Over time, Larry's activist issues and his influence have morphed from local community to national to international in vision and scope. And it's all over the web. There's a wonderful website, a couple of websites for you to find. Larry has both talked the talk and walked the walk, seeking justice. I suspect we can learn a few things from him that just might apply to our own walking the walk ourselves in our own ways. So let's listen to Larry Hamm.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Power to the people. See, I'm not going to greet you one way in one place and another way. Everywhere I go, I say power to the people. So I'm going to say it here too. Power to the people. All right. I'm so glad to be here with you. So glad to be here with you, my brothers and sisters. May I call you my brothers and sisters? I like that. Yes, brother. Thank you so much. You are my brothers and sisters, and all those people who struggle to seek justice, I consider my brothers and my sisters. And we should consider each other our brothers and our sisters. Fellow strugglers, more than ever before, we have to unite and support one another and put our hand once again to the plow for social change. Because I know that you, like myself, wake up every morning wondering what is number 45 going to do next. And you and I both know that if there was ever a time that we needed a fight for justice, that time is now. I'm so good, thank you, yes, thank you. I'm so glad to be here this morning. First, I want to thank Elizabeth Sirkin and apologize to her. I'm probably the most unruly and uncontrollable guest speaker she's ever had. I can't tell you how many emails that poor woman has sent me that I didn't respond to. I was so unresponsive that she put Lori on me. She said, Lord, you got to handle, put a harness on him and get him in here. But Miss Sirkin, thank you very much for all your efforts. Give Elizabeth a hand. Give her a hand. Thank you very much. And I'm so glad to be here with you. And I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Swain, that introduced me. And we were sitting and talking over there. And I was asking questions. And I heard someone, I believe your executive director was speaking, and he said something about Quakers. And I said, Quakers? I said, is this institution, I said, did he say Quakers? And he said, yes. He said, this institution is associated with the Quakers. Now, when I was a little boy, all I knew about Quakers, Tracy, was the oatmeal man. The guy that was on the oatmeal box. Who is better for me? Who is better for thee than me? Quaker oatmeal. But since then, I learned that the Quakers at one time were the only denomination in the United States of America that had officially gone on record as opposing slavery. And I have been asked to speak this morning about civil rights, racial justice, and their intersectionality. So that, I think, is a good place to begin. The fact that the Quakers, not the Baptists, not the Lutherans, not the Methodists, not the Anglicans, but the Quakers were the first denomination to officially, as a denomination, not as individuals within the congregation or within the faith, but the first denomination as a body to go on record opposing slavery. In fact, I learned that the first anti-slavery tract issued in colonial America was issued by the Quakers in 1625. That's significant because the first Africans arrived in the American colonies at Jamestown, Virginia on August 23rd, 1619. So within 6 years, the Quakers had already begun to agitate against slavery. And as a descendant of those who were enslaved in this country, I want to say thank you to the Quakers for being anti-slavery, being first in the struggle to abolish slavery in the United States of America. I feel obliged to say thank you. I don't know what all has gone on between now and then. There's probably a lot that we could argue about and discuss that has gone on in the last 300 years. But with all the discussion that is going on right now about slavery, Confederate monuments, the Civil War, you know, I go around to speak regularly I go around to speak. I got to be honest, right? I go around to speak, and I often talk about the Civil War. And people have come up to me, not just white people, black people too, especially young people. They come up to me and they say, why you talk so much about the Civil War? That was 150 years ago. Why are you still talking about the Civil War? Because I believe that you can't understand what is going on in the United States of America today, this day, in the 21st century, unless you understand what happened before, during, and after the Civil War. Because the fundamental paradigm has not changed. Conditions have changed. Laws have changed. Demographics have changed. But the fundamental paradigm of white supremacy and white superordination and black oppression and black subordination has not changed. And it is still on the agenda that we must fight to put racism, white supremacy, and all racist ideology in the trash can of history. That struggle is still going on, and we have to carry out that fight. We have to carry out that fight. 1625, the Quakers introduced that tract. And for several centuries before that, Africans had been enslaved. You know, our children, I have 3 daughters. I'm so proud of my daughters. I could talk all day, but I'm not here to talk about my daughters. But I'm proud of all 3 graduates of Rutgers University. The youngest will be graduating in May. My oldest daughter is a nurse, doing quite well. My middle daughter is a TV anchor and television news reporter. And my youngest daughter is going to graduate with a double major in criminal justice and politics. I'm so proud of my children. You know, I could be standing here telling a different story, but I'm able to stand here and tell you that I'm proud of my children and that my children are doing very well. But my children grew up in Newark and in Montclair, New Jersey, and they went to public schools. I'm a product of public schools. And it is so ironic that every October, we just passed this holiday, this Christopher Columbus holiday. Every October, our children, my children, and maybe your children and grandchildren when they were in school, on October 12th, they would sing Columbus Sailed the Ocean Blue in 1492. For many weeks he was at sea, sailing ships that numbered 3. When I was a little boy, I liked Columbus Day. I liked every holiday, as a matter of fact. Any day that would close schools, I liked it as a little boy. And I liked Columbus Day, and I sang that song with everybody else. But we are talking today about slavery and the Civil War. We're talking about in the 21st century. The fact is that the enslavement of Africans in the Western Hemisphere begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean. See, when he arrived, you know, our children, they cut out the little ships, right? The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. And in October, you can ride by schools and see the 3 ships that the students have made pasted on the front windows of the school, right? It looks so nice, and you ride by there, and you think everything is beautiful and okay. But the truth is that those ships were slave ships. Columbus took slaves on his first voyage. I mean, can I talk about this? I see some people kind of getting tensed up, but don't invite me here now if you're not going to let me say what's on my heart. Because I didn't come here to sing you a nice song and to tell you everything is okay. I came here to try to tell the truth as I understand it. And Columbus arrives in the Caribbean, and on his first voyage, he took slaves from the indigenous peoples, the Arawak, the Carib, the Taino, the Boricua, and took them back to Spain. In fact, after Columbus and his sons got lands to establish plantations, they treated their slaves so bad that the king and queen of Spain sent soldiers and had Columbus arrested. And after the enslavement of the indigenous people didn't work out so well, they went to get the African. They had had experience with the Africans. African slavery doesn't begin in the Western Hemisphere. European enslavement of Africans begins almost several hundred years before they even get to the Western Hemisphere. In January 1492, there were at least 60,000 enslaved Africans on plantations in the Mediterranean. The Portuguese had already gone down the west coast of Africa and were engaging in the slave trade. Columbus himself, Christopher Columbus, Cristoforo Colombo, Cristobal Colon, as he was known in different countries and in different languages, learned the art of navigation by his participation in what was called the Guinea slave trade. Because remember, the Portuguese were engaged with the Guinea coast of West Africa. That's where Columbus learned the art of navigation, even before his voyages to the Western Hemisphere. Engaged with the Portuguese in the enslavement and trade in African bodies. And then our children, every October 12th, sing the song. Little black and brown children sing the song. Little children, the descendants of those indigenous peoples, the descendants of those Africans, and descendants of Europeans that in fact interacted with those indigenous and with those Africans, they sing that song praising this man who in his own journals, don't take my word for it, we have the internet now, and we have Google, and anything I say right now, you can just take your phone. I know, Larry Hamm, I know that's not true. Let me look it up right now. Did Columbus really take slaves? Yes, he did. He took slaves. He enslaved people in his own journals. When they were enslaving the indigenous, Columbus said, if they did not bring me a thimble full of gold, a thimble. You all who are seamstresses know what a thimble is, right? The little thing you put on your finger. A thimble full of gold every day. Those who failed to do so would have their hands cut off. I mean, if you really knew the kinds of things that happened, it wasn't just amputation of hands and legs and fingers and arms. Flailing. You know what flailing is? Flailing is when you skin a human being alive as you would do to an animal. Roasting people alive. This is what happened during the slave trade, during the enslavement of both the Indian and the African. And yet their descendants praise the progenitor of this enterprise in the Western Hemisphere. For African people and indigenous people, Columbus Day is not a day of celebration. It should be a day of mourning. It should be a day of mourning for all people of conscience. And a reminder of where we are in the cosmic map of time. We are not so far away from that. In my own lifetime, I can remember legal segregation, Jim Crow segregation in the United States. They said 17, you can see I'm not 17 years old anymore. I'm 63, will be 64 years old. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be here. But we are not so far from all of that. Jim Kelly, is it not Jim Kelly? General Kelly. President Trump, one of his advisors, his cabinet members, said last week, you know, that we could have avoided the Civil War if we only could have compromised. Now, you can't imagine how this must have sounded to black people, for whom the 3/5 compromise was enshrined in the Constitution. The whole history of the United States from the beginning of colonization to the founding of the country to the firing of the first shots at Fort Sumner in 1861, all those years was one compromise after another with the institution of slavery, the peculiar institution. Our Constitution, you know, people refer to it as the 3/5 clause. And a lot of people think that it directly means that black people were 3/5 of a person. Well, I guess you could construe that. But the fact of the matter was, the country, the slaveholders were always struggling. This country is founded in this struggle, in this grappling with slavery. You can see it in the writings of the founders, that they're wrestling with the contradiction. You know, how you can write a document that the world worships as a document of freedom. You know, the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet the person who wrote that had people chained up on his plantation, was engaged in the rape of a minor, a 13-year-old girl with whom he had many children, Sally Hemings. Can you see the contradictions, brothers and sisters? Can you understand the basis of this social schizophrenia that America has had for the last 250 years? Because from the beginning, we were overwhelmed by the contradiction between what we professed in our religious gatherings and in our religious institutions and in our official governmental gatherings, the contradiction between what we professed and what the actual practice was. And we are still in the grips of that contradiction today. Because I say to you today that this country is as racist today in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century when Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. I know that's hard for a lot of you to grapple with. And you know why it's hard? Because all of us, to one degree or another, are prisoners of false consciousness. Our minds, our thoughts, how we look at things, what we think about things are shaped. They're not just produced independently by our own brains. They are shaped by the events. They are shaped by the institutions. They are shaped by the propaganda. They are shaped by what we are taught. They are shaped by what our families taught us. And we look through those prisms, not at a clear picture of what is really going on, but through a prism, but through a scope that was shaped by all these forces which could not exculpate themselves from the racist ideology that had been perpetrated in this country. And this is why, to this day, we have a hard time dealing with the issue of race. Because we struggle constantly between what we think about the issue and the reality of the issue. Three-fifths clause was put in the Constitution so that the slaveholders could have more power. You see, the colonies of the North had larger populations had larger white populations than the colonies of the South. And let us be clear that America was a colonial settler nation. That America was the first apartheid country. We talk about South Africa, but the South Africans learned it from us. Apartheid as an official government policy and ideology did not begin in South Africa until the 20th century. And they lifted from our law books the laws of racial segregation. And they lifted from our policies toward the indigenous Native Americans of this country. They lifted from that and developed from that the system of Bantustans in South Africa. So they learned it from us. The only people who could vote at the time of the founding of the country were propertied white men. White women couldn't vote. White men that did not have property couldn't vote. Of course, Native Americans couldn't vote. And of course, Africans couldn't vote. So the struggle was between the white population of the North and the white population of the South, and they wanted more power. And how did they get that more power? They said, well, we will count 3/5 of our slave population toward the total population of our colony, and that will give us greater representation in the Congress. That was one way they did it. And you know the other way they did it was with the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate, which initially was not popularly elected by state legislatures, gave regardless of what the size of the population of the state was, it gave 2 representatives to each state. So little Rhode Island, with a couple of thousand people, could have 2 representatives, the same number that New York State could have. That gave them more power. And there was one more institution that they used. Do you know what that institution was? It haunts us to this day. The Electoral College. The Electoral College. Now, we learn about democracy as majority rules. And we start learning about this in kindergarten, right? We elect class representatives in school. Who wins? The person with the most votes. We elect council people. Who wins? The majority vote. We elect state legislators and senators. Who wins? The majority vote. We elect Congress people, U.S. senators and House of Representatives members. Who wins? 50 plus 1%. We just had a gubernatorial election in New Jersey this week. Who won? The guy with more than 50% of the vote. It is only when we come to the President of the United States that a little group of people, even though we had an election where nearly 140 million people participated in that election, in fact, over here in the corner, a little group of 538 people, equal to the number of people in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, actually choose the president. And so we have in the White House now someone who did not win the popular vote. It wasn't even close like it was with Kennedy against Nixon in 1960. The person that's in there now lost by 3 million votes. Tell me how democratic that is. That looks like white minority rule to me. I think that we should have direct election of the President of the United States, and we need to abolish the Electoral College. These things haunt us. These things from the past haunt us and keep pulling us back. The last 3 elections were all anomalies. The last 3, and I'm going to tell you something. If we don't abolish this Electoral College, we will come back to this place again and again and again. Yeah. And I don't know how many times this can happen, and that our democratic infrastructure will be able to hold up under that. Because there's a lot of discontent in the land. If you looked at the vote in New Jersey, and if you looked at the vote in Virginia, And if you look at the voting that took place in races all across the country, it was the lowest voter turnout in the history of the country. Because fewer and fewer people are voting because they don't believe their voice really counts. And I'm going to tell you something. Prince University, my alma mater, completed a study last year which said that America is not a democracy. It is in fact a plutocracy ruled by an oligopoly. Now I know that's a lot of lees. But money is in control. And that's why people aren't voting, because they know it. They know it's not the best person that becomes the candidate that wins the primary and wins the general election. We all know it's the person with the most money. It's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And that's why people are becoming increasingly alienated. And this demands change, brothers and sisters. It demands change. It doesn't have to be this way. Brother Swain was talking about when he began his struggle as an activist. We were talking in the hallway about how long we've been on this road. I haven't been on this road as long as some of you in this room, but I have been on this path for 46 years. I started when I was 17. I wasn't a political activist when I started. I didn't come from a political family. My family were not civil rights campaigners. My father was a truck driver. He drove Mack trucks. Some of y'all remember Mack trucks? Yeah. My father drove Mack trucks. My mother was a seamstress who worked in the cleaners around the corner. My people didn't talk about politics. But something happened in 1967. You call it the Newark Riot. We call it the Newark Rebellion. And it forced, for the first time in my family, it forced them to sit down with me. Because I'm 13 years old. I'm wondering why people tearing up everything. Why is everybody so mad? Then my grandfather had to sit down and talk to me. My grandfather, when my father died when I was 4 years old, so my mother went back to live with her parents. So my grandfather became my father. And I had to ask my grandfather, Papa, why are people so mad? Why are people doing this? He said, Bootsy, that was what they called me when I was a kid, because I like cowboy boots. He said, Bootsy, I was in the war. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't know if he was talking about World War I or World War II. I kind of figured it must have been World War I. He said, Bootsy, I was in the war. And when I went to France, he said, when I got off the ship and I went to France, he said the white people in France came up to me and asked to see my tail. Because the American whites who had come before told the French people black people had tails. That we were something less than human. My grandfather hated the South. My people were from Georgia, from Gainesville. My grandfather hated the South so much. He never told me about a lot of his experiences. That one thing he told me about the Army. He didn't even talk about what was going on in Georgia. He said, Bootsy, I went to fight for America. And when I got to France, they asked to see my tail. My grandfather, he hated the South so much. I remember him and my mother having a conversation because my grandfather had cancer. He had cancer of the lung. he was a smoker, a chain smoker. By trade, he was a boiler man. You know what a boiler man is? That's the guy that in the basement that runs the big furnaces. He ran the furnaces in a paper company in Bloomfield, New Jersey. He said, Grace, when I die, don't send me back down south. He said, if you put me on that train and send me down south, I'm going to get up off the train and come back and beat your behind. That's how much my grandfather hated the South. He hated the South because of racism, because of segregation, because of slavery and the remnants of slavery. When I was a little boy, I was bad. I was a bad kid. I got thrown out of school in the 8th grade. I threw rocks at the school and broke out the school windows. So with bad kids like me, there was a practice of sending us down south during the summer. Because if we stayed home during summer vacation, we'd get locked up. So they would send me down south. So in 1960, my mother, my Aunt Joan, who was my grandmother's sister, my Aunt Gladys, who was my mother's sister, and I got on the train. This train is called the Amtrak. Today, the train was called then the Silver Meteor. Today, it is still running, but it's an Amtrak train, and it runs the breadth of the East Coast, from Maine to Florida. And it is a train upon which many black people came from the South to the North. You know, those of us in Newark, you know, we were going to New York, but the conductor said, New York! And we jumped off. we thought we was in New York. We got on the train at Penn Station in Newark, New Jersey. Everything was fine. I liked riding the train. I liked the cafe car. You know, that was a big thing for me when I was a kid. That you could have a train, that you could eat in the restaurant on the train. That was just, just couldn't get a hold of that, you know. I liked the cafe car and the pre-made sandwiches. But something happened when we got to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., the citadel of democracy. It was in Washington, D.C., at Union Station, that the conductor came to my family, Brother Swain, and said, y'all gonna have to move to the rear of the train. Because why did this happen in Washington? Because Washington sat on what was called the Mason-Dixon line. And when you went through Washington, the racist segregationist laws of interstate travel came into effect. You know, people think about Washington, the citadel of democracy. Washington was a segregated town. It was a Jim Crow town until the 1960s. You read Adam Clayton Powell's autobiography, a black person couldn't even go into the cafeteria at the House of Representatives. And that conductor came up to us and said, y'all gonna have to move to the back of the train. Now, my mother was a very passive woman. My Aunt Joan was deeply religious and very passive. But my mother's sister Gladys, man, she was a fireball. I thought we wasn't gonna make it to Georgia. She raised so much sand, but it was either get thrown off the train, and we didn't have money to buy another ticket, or it was go along and get to Georgia. So finally, we went to the rear of the train. In the citadel of democracy, where the Lincoln Monument is, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Monument, the Capitol Building, the White House, that's where the laws of racist interstate segregated travel began. And I experienced these things. People talk about segregation in the South. Man, the North had slavery. New Jersey had slavery. Pennsylvania had slavery. My state, New Jersey, you know what the most active slave port was on the East Coast? Not somewhere down in North Carolina and South Carolina and Florida. The most active slave port on the East Coast was New York City. Where Wall Street is today is where the auction block was. And after New York City, the next most active slave port was Perth Amboy, New Jersey, because it was deep water. And the next most active one after that was Camden, New Jersey. And when Lincoln runs for president in 1860, he didn't win New Jersey because Jersey's sympathies were with the South. Because the economy of the South was tied up with the economy of New Jersey. The cotton came from the South to Jersey's textile mills in Paterson and in other cities, were turned into cloth and then sent and sold back to the South. So there was money being made. That's why it took a war to end slavery. So much money was being made. In 1860, the largest forms of capital in the United States, larger than industrial and banking capital combined, was the investment in the institution of slavery. Lincoln doesn't win in 1860. He don't win in 1864 in New Jersey. There were 12,500 registered slaves in New Jersey. New Jersey was the last northern colony to abolish slavery, and it didn't abolish it on its own accord. It was abolished by passage of the 13th Amendment. There were 36 states, 9 were in rebellion. You needed 27 to amend the Constitution. New Jersey was not in the 27th state majority to vote in favor of the 13th Amendment. Slavery only abolished because of the federal law that was passed. When Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in New Jersey, when he issues it in the country, September 22nd, 1862, becoming effective January 1st, 1863, the state legislature of New Jersey nullifies Lincoln's power to emancipate slaves in the state. See, you always want to think about these things. Oh, that's down south, that's over here, that's over there. It's right here. And racism was here in 1860. It was here in 1920. And racism and racial inequality is still here today. And those of us who say we are anti-racist, we need to be in that fight for racial equality in the United States of America. We need to be in that fight. And we look around today. We coming up on the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King. It's celebrated in the country on the third Monday of every month. Nobody gave us Dr. King's holiday. We had to fight for Dr. King's holiday. The fact of the matter is we had to fight for everything that we have. The fact really, if I wanted to get real deep, and I don't have much time left to get that deep, anything that we have from the government that benefits people had to be fought for. Had to be fought for. We all take the 8-hour workday for granted. There was no 8-hour workday in 1860 or in 1865 or in 1878. Working people fought and died for the 8-hour workday, which we take for granted today. All y'all in here probably collecting Social Security, right? Medicare, Medicaid. There was no Social Security prior to 1933. Social Security came about because there was a movement for social justice in this country in the 1930s, during the Roosevelt administration, when Roosevelt proposed Social Security as a national policy because it already existed in some states. The National Manufacturers Association started a campaign to try to make people think that Roosevelt was insane. When you got old, your family should take care of you. People fought for Social Security. People fought for unemployment insurance. Women didn't have the right to vote in the 20th century. All you women in here that went to the polls yesterday went like it was nothing, like it was routine, like it was something boring. But I'm telling you, if it had not been for those women suffragettes those women who were getting arrested, those women who were protesting, those women who were maligned because they were on picket lines talking about women are equal to men. You wouldn't have been able to go in that polling place yesterday if it hadn't been for those women. They use a fancy word today called intersectionality. I'm old school. I'm OG. I'm old school. I can't keep up with these terms. I know racism and I know inequality. And I know that Dr. King once made a speech and he told me, all things are interrelated. Could I transpose that and say, all things are intersectional? When I was a little boy at Arts High School, when I had just graduated from South 17th Street School and I went to Arts High, the first week we had the freshman orientation. They had the whole freshman class there. All the faculty and all the staff was there. They were telling us all about Arts High School. And then the principal got up and said, now I want the student council president to come forward and talk about the student government, and talk about the Halloween party, and talk about the UNICEF collection. My school at that time was integrated. The student council president was a young white boy, a senior at Arts High School. He got up, he walked to the podium, and he started to talk. But he didn't talk about the student government. He didn't talk about the UNICEF collection. He didn't talk about the Halloween party. He started talking about the war in Vietnam. Now, I'm 13 years old. I had just been thrown out of school, let back in, and they let me graduate. I didn't want no trouble. I'm sitting in the audience. The principal stood up, said, David, don't talk about the Vietnam War. Talk about the student government. Talk about the UNICEF collection. Talk about the Halloween party. David kept talking about that war in Vietnam. The principal got up, put his hands on David, and I'm sitting there in the front row of that auditorium at Arts High School, and I'm watching David and the principal in a fight at the podium at my first day of school. And all the teachers said, why is David acting like that? All the administrators said, he needs to sit down. Maybe we need to throw him out of school. But I'm here to tell you today, 50 years later, that that young man was right for standing on his principles, because that war in Vietnam was wrong. As Dr. King said, it was a demonic suction tube sucking up money from the war on poverty, turning it into bombs dropped on little brown people. Had it not been for people like David, many more young American boys and Vietnam people would have been killed in that war. That young man was right. And I'm here to tell you that those people that you would condemn for standing up, for being nonconformists, for not getting in line, for not accepting the party line, for not dressing like everybody else and talking like everybody else and acting like everybody else. If it hadn't been for those crazy people, we wouldn't have any of the rights that we have today. So we find ourselves now in the 21st century, still grappling with the issues of racism and sexism and economic inequality, that the very civil rights that we fought for and died for. Do you know how many people think the civil rights movement, they think of Dr. King, they think of I Have a Dream, they think that Dr. King was sitting under a tree somewhere dreaming a dream. You know, Dr. King was arrested 39 times. There were many attempts on Dr. King's life. Many civil rights workers, black and white, were killed during the civil rights movement. So when somebody comes up to you and says, we died for the right to vote, that is not a cliche. That is a historical fact. And that is why we have to exercise our right to vote. No matter what they do, no matter what policies they try to put in place to suppress the vote. And so we see ourselves now in the second decade of the 21st century actually having to fight to try to hold on to not just the gains that were made during the civil rights movement, not just the gains that were made during the women's movement, not just the gains that were made during the labor movement, but we are fighting, in fact, to preserve nearly 100 years of social progress. That's what has been going, and it's not just the Trump administration. Trump is the current administration, and we need to deal with him the best way we can. In fact, I'm going to just say it because I really don't care. I'm not running for office, so you ain't got to vote for me. But we need to impeach that guy. That guy should be impeached. He is unfit for office. He is unfit. He's already violated the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. He's violated the 25th Amendment and probably 20 other amendments too. But he's just getting away with it because his team is in power. But you can't just blame Trump. What we have been in for the last 40 years, since the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, we have been in a slow motion coup. A coup by the right wing who has seized all branches of the government. They control the legislative branch. They control the executive branch with the appointment of Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Now they control the judicial branch. And you think they're finished? Not by a long shot. What their goal is to call a constitutional convention to, in fact, rewrite the very Constitution and abolish many of those rights contained in the Bill of Rights. Right now, this right wing controls 32 of the 50 state legislatures in the country. To call a constitutional convention, they would need 34, 2/3 of the states, to call a constitutional, 2 legislatures away from calling a constitutional convention. If you think I'm wrong, just look it up. This effort for a national constitutional convention is being funded with millions of dollars from the Koch brothers. And you all sleeping, you think everything is okay? Man, you're going to wake up one morning, you're going to look at your Social Security check and be like, what happened to my check? They want to privatize Social Security. They want to give your Social Security funds over to Wall Street and let them gamble with it like they gambled with the economy for the last several decades. And you know what their gambling brought us. It brought us the worst recession since the Depression of the 1930s. Right now, Trump has proposed the largest increase in military spending in history, $54 billion. And then his Congress turned around and gave him $60 billion. Where do you think that money is coming from? There'll be a commensurate number of cuts in social programs to provide the money for that military increase. And guess what they want to cut? Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the things that you depend on. Some of y'all walking around here talking about politics don't affect me. Man, you out of your mind. Every aspect of your life is touched by the government. You just not conscious enough to understand it. But I tell you, brothers and sisters, now is the time for us to unite. Now is the time for us to find a way to intersect our movements. Yes, we need intersectionality. We need to intersect our movements. We need to intersect the movement of senior citizens for security with the black movement, with the movement of the dreamers. We need to intersect those movements with the peace movement. We need to intersect those with the labor movement. We need to intersect those with the gay movement. Yes, we all have our different vineyards in which to labor. Of course, it's only logical that women that are affected by sexual oppression are going to unite as women and blacks as black. But I tell you, as I stand here, 63 going on 64 years old, that to make the kind of transformation that Dr. King was talking about, no one group is going to be able to carry it out. We all have to unite. All people of conscience need to unite in one great movement to make this country the kind of country that it can be. This is a great nation, but it can be a greater nation. There's no reason why in a nation this rich that we can't have universal health care for everybody in the United States. There's no reason why in a country this rich that we can't provide a free college education for every student who is worthy to go to school. There's no reason why in a country this rich that we can't provide a living wage for every working person. How can you work 40 hours a week and not make enough money to support your family? There's no reason why, if we can bail out the banks and bail out the corporations, that we can't bail out the 5 million homeowners that lost their homes during the last economic recession. The wealth is there. This country, you don't ever see them talk about, whenever we come with something, they talk about, well, there ain't no money. But when they want a tax break, a $1.75 trillion tax break, you don't hear them saying no money now. They're willing to blow a hole in the whole damn budget so that that greedy 1% can live in a manner that only kings of old could even dream about. I'm telling you, friends, it is time for us to unite. It is time for us to come together. Let us find a way to put aside all these differences and unite and continue the work that Dr. King and all the other martyrs of our movement were engaged in. Thank you very much. Power to the people.